The war on Iran has quickly moved beyond the Middle East as it tests the strength and limits of global alliances, especially with Asia's major powers.
Nations face a careful balancing act of pursuing their own regional priorities while maintaining cooperation with the United States. Let's bring in our correspondents from China, India, and Japan for a conversation. Michio Ishida joins us this morning from Tokyo, while Ishan Gang is tracking developments for CNA from New Delhi.
That's right. Also with us is Tan Yuguan from Shanghai. So let's begin with you, Yuguan, with China perhaps the most exposed to disruptions along the Strait of Hormuz. What does Beijing stand to lose from a protracted war?
Well, I'll be careful about calling China the most vulnerable. In absolute numbers, yes. But in relative exposure, that's a different story. A recent study suggests that over a third or to half of China's total crude supply in 2025 was directly exposed to the Hormuz. That is still a lot, but China also has more alternatives than, for example, Japan. China has Russia supply, pipeline inflows, domestic production, and also larger inventories. Japan, by comparison, is more exposed. According to Japan's trade ministry, 90% of its oil imports pass through the Hormuz. So China is not the most vulnerable structurally, but that does not mean China gets off lightly because China's economy is so large and so tied to manufacturing. Even a smaller proportional shock can still hit hard, and it goes beyond just higher transport costs. For example, I spoke to a furniture maker in Jiaxing, just 2 hours drive from Shanghai, and he told me that raw material suppliers are already warning of price hikes for foam, fibers, polyester fabrics used in sofa, and in some cases, around 30% hike. That's because polyester and most furniture foam are petrochemical products. They are tied directly to oil and gas supply chains. At the same time, Beijing is trying to cushion some of the pain at home. Just this week, we heard that they announced that the domestic fuel prices will rise by much less than the normal pricing formula would have implied. Now, this means the hike in pump prices would have been almost twice as much if the state did not intervene. But the cost has to go somewhere. Historically, state refiners absorb the squeeze first, then the state steps in with subsidies. So ultimately, it's the taxpayers' money. So Beijing's concern is not abstract. China may not be the most vulnerable in relative terms, but this war is already feeding into costs, margins, and confidence at home.
Ishan, let's get you in on the conversation. India also a lot at stake with 10 million Indians living in the Middle East. But the question really is about its BRICS alliance with Iran. That's now in question after the Prime Minister, went to Israel just before the war began. I think this was late February. So the question is, how will India manage this dilemma without compromising on its priorities?
Well, in the last several years, we have seen India really walk diplomatic tightropes, one after the other, be it during the war between Russia and Ukraine or now. We have seen statements come out from India where India has been critical of attacks on civilian infrastructure and energy infrastructure, but never criticized which party might have carried out those attacks. And it's this kind of statement that highlights what India's position has been. Throughout the Modi years in India, we have seen India's foreign policy centered around this idea of strategic autonomy, which essentially means that India wants to be allies with nobody, enemies with nobody, and wants to keep diplomatic channels open with everybody. And on a bilateral level, this seems to have helped because India has now secured access to 4 of its energy shipments crossing through the Strait of Hormuz. But on multilateral levels, this might be proving to be a bit more complicated, especially when it comes to the BRICS grouping, because inside these groups we are seeing countries standing on different sides of the aisle. 2 nations, Iran and UAE, which are part of the BRICS grouping, Iran wants BRICS to take a strong stance condemning US and Israel. We don't quite know what UAE's formal stance on it is, but Iran has been pushing BRICS groupings to condemn the attacks that have happened on it. India's foreign ministry says that because of the nature of the countries which are part of this grouping, a consensus on the conflict has been difficult to reach. Analysts here are saying that India is not going to take sides in this war. As the chair of the BRICS grouping this year, its idea would be to push towards a consensus. What that consensus looks like, we are yet to see.
Okay, so let's turn now to Michio, because like other U.S. allies, President Trump has also pressed Japan to participate more in the war against Iran. To what extent can Japan really be involved, especially with limits set by their constitution?
Well, yes, Japan's pacifist constitution does limit what Japan can do. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said in the upper house session this week, nothing has been decided regarding the deployment of the self-defense forces. She said she told President Trump what Japan can and cannot do, although details have not been unveiled during her meeting with Mr. Trump last week in Washington. The self-defense forces cannot be mobilized to a conflict zone under the SDF law. Now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called Japan's minesweeping capabilities one of the best in the world, indicating the U.S. was looking into this. Now, Japan does have a track record. For example, in 1991, minesweepers were deployed to the Persian Gulf after the Gulf War. And this was in response to the U.S. dissatisfaction for Japan's so-called checkbook diplomacy. In 2020, Japan sent its escort vessels in the name of intelligence gathering operation in response to Mr. Trump's call to maintain security around the Arabian Sea. For Japan, 95% of its crude oil comes from the Middle East and 90% pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Japanese government said 45 vessels were stuck in the Persian Gulf with 24 Japanese crew members since the attack a month ago on Iran. Foreign Minister Toshimitsu Motegi said he spoke with his Iranian counterpart twice this month. And former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, as chairman of the Japan-Iran Parliamentarian Friendship League, met with Iranian ambassador to Japan on Thursday. Historically, Japan has good relations with Iran and has means of communications. And Japan wants Iran to assure safe navigation for all international vessels, given many countries are starting to suffer from the lack of fuel. Japan has had around 250 days worth of crude oil reserves before the Iranian crisis, and Japan released its oil reserve twice at the request of the International Energy Agency and plans to release more.
Mitchell, I want to ask you a bit more about the U.S.-Japan alliance. There are worries, concerns that U.S. priorities on the Indo-Pacific region may shift because Washington is pouring resources into fighting the Islamic Republic. So what can the Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, do to make sure Washington remains committed to their alliance? And of course, you know, China comes into play here as well.
Well, when Ms. Takaichi was in Washington last week, one of her top priorities, according to the Japanese Foreign Ministry, was to reaffirm U.S. commitment in the Indo-Pacific as well as to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. And in terms of Indo-Pacific, that was realized based on a statement released from the White House stating the two countries will bolster deterrence to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific. This included U.S. commitment to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element of regional security and global prosperity, and opposition to any attempt to unilaterally change the status quo, including by force or coercion. Now, this statement doesn't name China, but it does give hints. Ms. Takaichi has strained ties with Beijing after her comment last November referring to a possible Taiwan contingency as a crisis of national existence. In other words, implying the right to exercise collective self-defense, and that means with the United States. Now, Ms. Takaichi told Mr. Trump when they met she was open to dialogue with Beijing. She wished for stable China-U.S. ties. And Mr. Trump assured her he would convey her message to the Chinese president when he visits China, now set for May. But just this week, a 23-year-old member of the self-defense force broke into the Chinese embassy in Tokyo with a knife. Tokyo received protests from the Chinese Foreign Ministry and its embassy. And Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara commented, calling the incident regrettable, and decided to step up security at embassies in Japan.
Okay, so back to you, Yuan. Beijing has been pursuing diplomatic channels, sending an envoy to the Middle East and maintaining constant communication with Iran's leadership. Just how effective will China be as a mediator, especially with its relationship with Iran?
Well, China has access here, but access comes with limits. Beijing has kept channels open with Tehran. Its Middle East envoy, Zai Jun, has been active, including meeting Iran's ambassador in Beijing in March this month. China's foreign minister was also in a phone call with his Iran counterpart this week. So China is involved. It does have a line into one of the key players, but access is not the same as leverage. And leverage is not the same as neutrality. China has a close strategic relationship with Iran, and that gives Beijing some influence. It remains an important economic partner, especially on energy. But that same relationship also makes it harder for China to present itself as a truly neutral broker. So the most realistic reading is China can help lower the temperature. It can pass messages. It can encourage restraint. It can support diplomatic off-ramp if the parties are looking for one. But it is much less likely to be the power that delivers a full settlement. Beijing's motives here are also very practical. It wants to prevent a wider regional war, protect key energy and trade routes, and show that China still has diplomatic weight in the Middle East. So yes, China can help keep channels open, but its role as a mediator should not be overstated.
Ishan, India has has friendly relations with Iran, such that it's one of 5 countries that have been granted safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. China is one of the others. But we also know that New Delhi has made progress in resetting ties with the United States. So I'm wondering how this war is going to affect that trajectory.
Well, we've seen conversations between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump just this week, where India's Prime Minister said that a lot of focus must be put on opening up the Strait of Hormuz, which isn't a direct reference to what happens as the outcome of the war, but it's being read here in New Delhi as a sign of New Delhi trying to push Washington towards reaching some sort of a settlement, because we understand Prime Minister Modi's point has been that the war is hurting global economy, it's hurting global supply chains, and it's one of the reasons why India is, analysts are trying to push Washington towards reaching some sort of a settlement. Now, in terms of how India navigates its relationships with Washington, with Tehran, and with Israel, we go back once again to the doctrine of strategic autonomy. We are seeing some signs that the war might actually be helping fulfill some points of what President Donald Trump wanted out of the relationship between India and the US. We are seeing India increasing its energy shipments from the United States, which helps cut down on the trade deficit that the US has been facing. And that could likely have an impact of Washington's view of New Delhi as well. But domestically, Indian government's priorities, we understand, are squarely focused on the energy issue at home as well, because we understand due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, though Indian ships are being allowed to pass now, there is still a supply crunch of cooking gas. So the Indian government in this at this time is split between trying to find diplomatic solutions to get its energy shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, pushing Washington to come to the negotiating table and potentially end the conflict, while also putting its eyes squarely on the energy situation as home as well.
All right, Ishan, thank you very much. Our correspondents in New Delhi, Shanghai, and Tokyo, Ishan Gak, Tan Yuguan, and Michio Ishida, for bringing us up to date and giving us the context. Thanks very much.